Hello and welcome to Firstpost. You are watching Vantage with me, Alyson le Grange. Our top focus is West Asia. After months of fighting Hamas, Israel is turning its focus north to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Does this mean the war in Gaza is winding up? Is Israel preparing for a war against Lebanon? We'll tell you more about the escalating flashpoint. Meanwhile, India and Russia are set to sign a new military pact. What does it cover, and how will the West react to it? Stay tuned to find out. In Kenya, protests against the new tax hike have worsened. President Ruto now says he's open to talks. In New Caledonia, protests have resumed after weeks of peace. A few public offices have been set on fire. In Los Angeles, mobile phones have been banned from schools. Have other cities tried this out? And what's the point of such a ban? We'll tell you on the show. And finally, a special report on the Hajj tragedy. Intense heat has killed more than 1,300 pilgrims. All this and more lined up for you. But first, the headlines. French far-right leader rules out sending troops to Ukraine if they win the election. But Jordan Bardella says that they will remain vigilant in the face of any Russian threats. France has been one of Ukraine's main Western backers since Russia invaded it in 2022. In February, President Emmanuel Macron said he won't rule out the possibility of deploying troops to Ukraine. Malaysia arrests 8 people with suspected links to the Islamic State terror group. Kuala Lumpur says they were planning attacks against the king and the premier. In March, a machete-wielding attacker with suspected ties to Al-Qaeda-linked group stormed the police station in the state of Johor and killed 2 officers. Iran and Bahrain agreed to launch negotiations on how to restore diplomatic relations. Bahrain cut ties with Iran in 2016, following in the footsteps of Saudi Arabia. On Sunday, Iran's acting foreign minister met with his Bahraini counterpart on the sidelines of the Asian Cooperation Dialogue Summit in Tehran. In India, Rahul Gandhi and Akhilesh Yadav led the opposition on day 1 of the parliament session. Prime Minister Narendra Modi took oath as a member of the 18th Lok Sabha, or the lower house of parliament. The leaders of the opposition staged protests outside the parliament amid the oath-taking of the newly elected MPs. And Ivory Coast battles floods and landslides. At least 24 people killed in its largest city, which is home to nearly 6 million people. The West African nation's economic capital has been receiving rain around 4 times heavier than normal. Is Israel preparing for a two-front war? There are growing signs that it might be. Benjamin Netanyahu has given an interview. He says Israel will wind down the intense fighting in Gaza. It won't be a complete end to the war. Instead, Israel would conduct more targeted operations there. Netanyahu is now signaling a shift in focus. He plans to send more troops to Israel's northern border.
After the intense phase is finished, we will have the possibility to move part of the forces north, and we will do this. First and foremost for defensive purposes, and secondly, to bring our evacuated residents home.
The Israeli Prime Minister was talking about the Israel-Lebanon border. Tensions have risen sharply there in the last month. There is a growing fear of a wider war in the region. In recent weeks, Israel has been hitting the Hezbollah hard. They have carried out strikes inside Lebanon and killed senior Hezbollah commanders. Hezbollah has also struck back. They have fired a large number of missiles and drones towards Israel. So far, it has been a tit-for-tat exchange. Does Israel plan to take it up a notch? Netanyahu isn't spelling out his plans yet, but his military is said to be making preparations. There is talk of a ground offensive in Lebanon. Netanyahu hasn't given any clear orders yet, but military options are very much on the table. The situation on the ground is grim. Mass evacuations have been ordered. On the Israeli side, over 60,000 people have been relocated. In Lebanon, more than 90,000 have been moved to safety. Now, Israel's defense minister is visiting the U.S. Yoav Gallant says that he will discuss the situation on the Lebanon border with the Americans.
In these meetings, I will discuss developments on the Gaza front, the Lebanon front, and they have a crucial importance at this time. We are prepared for any action that may be required in Gaza, Lebanon, and in other places as well.
As expected, the international community is worried. The United Nations is raising an alarm. The UN says the risk of a wider war in West Asia is real and it must be avoided. The UN Secretary General has spoken too. Antonio Guterres says the world cannot afford Lebanon to become another Gaza. European leaders are expressing concerns as well.
No, I am more worried. Much more worried. Much more. Every day the crises are spilling over. Every day there are more bombing on both sides of the border of Lebanon. Until that unhappily we are on the eve of the war spending.
So the situation is dangerous. Israel's main backer, the US, tried to make an intervention. Last week, Antony Blinken met Israeli officials. He told them to avoid further escalation. But it appears those appeals fell on deaf ears. There is no shift in Israel's stance. Netanyahu says Israel can fight on several fronts. And they are prepared to do that. What would that situation look like? What if Israel launches an offensive into Lebanon? Now, the U.S. military has put together an assessment. They say if Israel goes ahead, Iran could get involved. Remember, Iran is the main backer of Hezbollah. It has been supporting the group since the 1980s. Tehran has provided the Hezbollah with all kinds of support, from funds to military equipment and training for its fighters. Now, reports say Iran provides around $700 million to Hezbollah every year. This is an estimate from 2018. In recent years, American sanctions have cut into this funding, but Tehran hasn't stopped supporting Hezbollah. It has helped the group build up a large arsenal. Take a look at this report. It talks about the Hezbollah's arsenal. Apparently, they have over 150,000 rockets and missiles, and they are not afraid to use them. Since the war in Gaza began, they have been firing rockets into Israel. This is to show their support for Hamas. Since last year, they have launched 5,000 rockets, anti-tank missiles, and explosive drones at Israel. If Israel launches an attack, the Hezbollah could easily scale up these operations. Now, the U.S. is worried about that scenario. They assess Hezbollah can fire 3,000 missiles a day. This could overwhelm Israel's Iron Dome. That's the Israeli air defense system, and the Hezbollah has a large number of fighters too. At least 100,000, according to one estimate. If Israel attacks, these numbers could grow. Already, Iran-backed fighters are raising their hands. They are willing to come to Lebanon and fight on behalf of Hezbollah. So fighting a war in Lebanon won't be the same as Gaza. Israel will face stronger resistance, and it will be on a larger scale. Both sides need to exercise caution. An escalation is the last thing anyone needs right now. Now, India and Russia are signing a new military pact. It has been delayed for many years now, but last week Russia approved it. Once India does the same, the deal will come into force. Now, what does this deal cover? It's mainly logistical issues. It gives India and Russia access to each other's military facilities, like ports and air bases. They can train easily together, visit each other's ports, and also get spare parts and maintenance. Basically, it makes military cooperation seamless. India has signed similar deals with other countries too, like the US, France, Vietnam, and South Korea. But this one, with Russia, could be more consequential. There are two reasons why. Number one, Russia is India's top military partner. Reports say more than 85% of Indian weapons have Russian origin, whether it's fighter jets, guns, or missiles. So this deal is a logical next step. Now, reason number two, Russia is at war. So any deal with Russia will be scrutinized by Western countries. They may criticize India for any such agreement. With that said, let's take a closer look at the agreement. What do both sides stand to get? Now, Russia is looking to expand its footprint in the Indian Ocean. Now, they are building a military base in Sudan, so chances are we will see more Russian ships in this region, and ships will need repair and replenishment. That's where this military pact will help. Indian ports could welcome and service Russian vessels. Now, New Delhi also stands to benefit. Russia is a key player in the Arctic region. We're talking about a place packed with resources. Fisheries, oil, minerals. The Arctic has it all. But accessing the Arctic is tough, especially for far-off countries like India. Again, that's where this military pact could help. Russia has more than 400 military facilities in the Arctic, and under this deal, India could access them. Right now, most of the Arctic is covered in ice throughout the year, but with global warming, that will change. As the Arctic ice melts, this region will become a flashpoint. So to recap, such a military pact will benefit India and Russia. Russia can access the Indian Ocean, India can access the Arctic. But what about the geopolitical implications? There are three main ones. Now, first is India's strategy. New Delhi signed a number of military pacts in the last decade, with the United States, with Australia, with France, and with some Southeast Asian states. As a result, India's military is able to extend outwards, especially the Indian Navy. Now, we have seen naval missions to distant parts of the Pacific, something that wasn't common before the last decade. And the reason is simple. Earlier, logistics used to be a nightmare, but these military pacts make it easier. Refueling is taken care of. Spare parts and repairs are not a worry. Even visas for military personnel are easier to get. So India has used these agreements to its advantage, to project power beyond its neighborhood. Secondly, it's a message to the West. America and its allies have tried to turn India away from Russia. In some cases, they have succeeded. Look at the period from 2009 to 2013. Russia made up 76% of India's defense imports. Now look at the last 5 years. It has come down to 36%. So India's reliance on Russian weapons has come down. At the same time, India is not abandoning Moscow. The relationship is very much alive. Which brings us to the third impact, a message to China. Beijing has eyes on the Indian Ocean and the Arctic. So New Delhi and Moscow are joining forces. They are trying to prevent a Chinese monopoly. It tells you how complicated things are. On the one hand, Russia and China are now close partners. On the other, they compete for the same regions. If India does approve this military pact, it will trigger some interesting conversations. The reaction from Washington will be one to watch out for. Moving on to Russia, it's reeling from another terror attack. The incident happened in Dagestan. It is a Muslim-majority republic with a history of unrest. The gunmen opened fire at places of worship, killing civilians and police officers, and even setting buildings on fire. 19 people were killed. 25 others remain injured. No group has yet claimed responsibility for the attack. But this is Russia's second terror attack in 3 months. So what explains this uptick in violence? Our next report tells you.
It was the day of Pentecost, a religious holiday in Russia. So people in Dagestan headed to churches. But little did they know, it would take a deadly turn. Gunmen opened fire on places of worship. Churches and synagogues were attacked. Police posts too were targeted. The attacks happened in 2 cities, Derbent and Makhachkala. At least 19 people have been killed, including 15 police officers. 6 gunmen were also neutralized.
Today has become a day of tragedy for Dagestan. And not only for Dagestan, but for our entire country. Unprecedented in their cruelty, terrorist attacks were committed today against religious sites in the capital of Dagestan, Makhachkala, and our ancient city of Derbent.
In Derbent, buildings were set on fire. This included a church and a synagogue. Attackers threw Molotov cocktails at the building. Among those killed were a priest who had served the city for over 40 years. Derbent is home to an ancient Jewish community, which makes this attack unprecedented. No group has claimed responsibility for the attacks yet, but Russia has called it an act of terror. Law enforcement agencies say it was the act of an international terror organization. Meanwhile, Dagestan's governor called it an attempt to destabilize his region. He suggested the attacks may have had foreign help. But the Kremlin is yet to comment on the attackers.
President Vladimir Putin expresses deepest condolences to all of those who lost their relatives both in Crimea in a missile attack and to relatives and close ones of those who died in Dagestan.
Which brings us to Dagestan. It lies in Russia's Caucasus region. Dagestan is a majority Muslim republic, but it is home to over 30 ethnic groups. Historically, the Caucasus became part of the Russian Empire in the 19th century. But it has long harbored resentment against Moscow. It is also one of the poorest parts of Russia. In the 2000s, Russia fought an Islamist insurgency in the region. Since 2007, the region has dealt with attacks from the Caucasus Emirate. It later became Islamic Emirate of the Caucasus. It staged attacks in Dagestan, even in some of the neighboring regions. Till 2017, the entire region was restive. Since then, attacks here have been rare, but the recent attack has brought it back into focus.
We understand who is behind the organization of these terrorist attacks. We understand what the organizers were trying to achieve.
Dagestan is on edge again, and it's because of its multiple ethnic groups. Dagestan is the most ethnically diverse region in Russia. And some of the ethnic minorities have been hit harder by the war in Ukraine. In 2022, protests broke out in Dagestan. This was against Putin's mobilization orders. Then there's the other war in Gaza. Tensions ran high in Dagestan after October 7th. In late 2023, anti-Semitic rioters stormed a Dagestan airport. This was after reports that a plane was arriving from Israel. Which brings us to this latest attack. This is the second terror attack in Russia in the last 3 months. In March, over 130 people were killed when terrorists attacked a concert hall in Moscow. ISIS-K claimed responsibility for that massacre. The attack was a blow to Putin. It happened just a week after he took office for the 5th time as Russia's president. Putin promised unity after the tragedy, but this latest attack shows that Russia has not successfully navigated internal tensions, and these have become a breeding ground for international terror groups.
Is China stirring trouble in Kashmir? It looks like they are. Now, recently, there has been a surge in violence in the valley, more than 5 attacks this month alone. So the Indian Army is hitting back. We have seen multiple operations and encounters. One such operation was in April. 2 terrorists were gunned down in Baramulla. Some equipment was also recovered from them. One is a piece that stands out, an ultraset. Now, these are special communication devices, a mix of mobile phones and walkie-talkies. Your mobile phone uses SIM technology to communicate, but the ultrasets do not. They use radio waves to communicate. Now, these particular ones were designed and made by the Chinese. That too for Pakistan's army. So how did terrorists in Kashmir get their hands on it? Well, the answer is obvious. Pakistan has long armed and funded terror groups in Kashmir. This is just another example of that. But the question is, did China know about it? Well, this incident is not unprecedented. Let's go back to December of 2022. The Indian Army busted a terror ring in Kashmir. They also discovered a weapons cache. Inside it were Chinese pistols. Another example is from 2023. Indian intelligence officials reported a worrying trend. Terrorists were using Chinese-made equipment like drones, grenades, and bodysuits. So the trend of Chinese meddling in Kashmir is not new. Beijing has been called out many times, yet they are on the same path. And this is the covert support to Pakistan's cause. There is overt support too. China is beefing up Pakistan's defenses along the LOC. That's the line of control. It's the dividing line between Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and Jammu and Kashmir. What sort of support is China giving? Now, they are laying underground fiber cables, setting up communication towers, sending radar systems for target detection, and even truck-mounted guns. So Chinese military support is pretty comprehensive. And don't forget the political support. India has pushed for sanctioning Pakistani terrorists at the UN Security Council. Consider what happened last year. India wanted to sanction Sajid Mir. He belongs to a Pakistan terror group that targets Kashmir. And guess who blocked India's proposal? China. They have done this repeatedly since 2019. The question is, why? Why is China stirring trouble in Kashmir? Now, there are mainly 2 reasons. First is financial. China has major investments in this region, so the military support is meant to keep the money safe. But the second reason is arguably bigger, to keep the Indian military tied down. India has 2 problematic frontiers, one with Pakistan and one with China. For decades, India was more focused on Pakistan, but that changed in 2020. Indian and Chinese soldiers clashed along the border. Dozens of personnel were killed. So India shifted focus to the China frontier. At the same time, the Pakistan frontier was stable. Terrorism had reduced in the Kashmir Valley. Plus, both countries signed a ceasefire deal in 2021, which kept the border largely peaceful. But China doesn't like that. If India is less focused on Pakistan, it will be more focused on China. So Beijing wants to prevent that. It wants Pakistan to keep the Kashmir frontier alive. This presents a new challenge for India. The army will now have to prepare for 2 active fronts. It's the rematch nobody wanted. Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. The 2 men are going head-to-head in the first presidential debate. It's slated for Thursday in Atlanta. Now, this debate is different from those of the past. Since 1988, a non-partisan group has conducted U.S. presidential debates. But not this time. This year's debates will be held by U.S. media companies. The first one by CNN, and the rules are quite interesting. No audience, no opening statements, and no pre-written notes. There is also a Trump-specific rule. You cannot speak out of turn. Even if you do, it won't matter because your mic will be muted. Both campaigns have agreed to these rules, but the question is, how will it pan out? What are both sides looking for? Broadly, 3 things. Biden's biggest challenge is showing up in full control. A lot of people have questioned his mental acuity. They say Biden is not fit for office. If those claims are true, the debate will expose him. So Biden's job is simple. Come across as fit and ready for another term. No gaps, no wandering thoughts, and certainly no dozing off. Now we come to Donald Trump. The gaffe part applies to him as well. At 78 years of age, the former president isn't a spring chicken. But his biggest challenge is the legal troubles. Trump is a convicted felon. He was found guilty on 34 different criminal counts. Joe Biden will weaponize that. And how will Trump respond? Polls show the conviction has hurt his popularity. Many fence-sitters are now abandoning him. In his speeches, Trump has largely deflected the issue. He simply calls it a witch hunt. But on Thursday, there will be follow-up questions. So wild and baseless statements will not help. The third issue is policy. Expect abortion and immigration to dominate the debate. As president, Trump worked to weaken abortion rights in the U.S. Judges appointed by him overturned Roe versus Wade. But recently, Trump has dialed down. Polls show that most Americans support abortion rights, so Trump has abandoned his radical position. He attended a Christian conference last week and listen to what he said there.
The whole thing was they wanted, the Roe v. Wade was federal, and they wanted it all back in the states where the people could vote and make their decisions. It's now up to the will of the people in each state. Some states will be more conservative, other states will be more liberal. It's happening now.
No radical sloganeering. Trump says states must decide on abortion. Biden's position is the opposite. He says abortion rights must be protected, not just in some states, but across the country. Next, we have immigration. It's a very important political issue in the U.S. Around 28% Americans say it's the most pressing problem. There are 11 million undocumented migrants living in the U.S. That is 3 times higher than in the 1990s. And Biden knows this. He recently unveiled a new policy on immigration. It will give citizenship to 500,000 undocumented migrants, most of whom are married to U.S. citizens. This will help Biden among Latino voters. Trump, too, is loosening his immigration stance. He says foreign students who graduate from America should get green cards. It's a shift in policy for him. In 2016, Trump was vehemently anti-immigration, but this time he's rethinking it. The question is, why? The opinion polls could hold the answer. Biden and Trump are almost neck and neck, so it's all about swinging the undecided voters. Many of them are put off by Trump's radical position on issues like abortion and immigration. Hence his decision to dial it down. But he will stick to the script on Thursday, or will he veer away from it? That's one thing to watch out for. And don't forget the personal taunts. Trump has been calling Biden a brain-dead zombie. Meanwhile, the Biden campaign has called Trump a convicted criminal. Will this name-calling continue on Thursday, or will both men focus on policy? Considering how bitter this campaign has been, the former seems likely. Now let's turn our attention to Africa, to Kenya in the east. Protests continue to rock the nation. Thousands have been demonstrating for a week now against a slew of new taxes that the government wants to impose on them. Kenya is looking to pass its annual finance bill, the budget for 2024 to 2025. The government seeks to raise $2.7 billion in additional revenue via taxes that may worsen Kenya's cost of living crisis. That is why people are protesting, and this seems to be working. Kenya's President William Ruto made an announcement. He says he is open to discussions with the peaceful protesters. Here's our report.
For a week now, some hashtags have been trending in Kenya, like hashtag Occupy Parliament and hashtag Reject Finance Bill 2024. Social media is abuzz with calls for resistance being led by young people, by Gen Z. They are the ones at the forefront of this fight, the fight against new tax hikes, and it's these young Kenyans who are bearing the brunt of police repression. 2 people have died in the protests so far, a 29-year-old who was reportedly shot in the leg and a 21-year-old who died after being hit by a tear gas canister. The Kenyan police have been using tear gas and water cannons to disperse protesters, even though the protests have been largely peaceful. Kenya's President William Ruto has acknowledged this.
I am very proud of our young people. They have stepped forward tribeless. They have stepped forward peaceful. And I want to tell them, we are going to engage them. We are going to have a conversation so that together we can build a greater nation.
Ruto made the announcement on Sunday. He said he wanted to have a conversation. But is there enough time? Kenya's annual budget or finance bill is about to get passed. This will set taxes for the next financial year, that is from July 1st, 2024 to June 30th, 2025. So it has to pass by the end of this month before the new financial year begins. Tomorrow is a crucial day. It's when the finance bill will have its third and final reading in Parliament. If it passes, it will go to Ruto's office. The protesters know that tomorrow's vote is critical, so they're planning a nationwide strike, a total shutdown. Ruto may be trying to avoid the strike by calling for a dialogue, but will the protesters agree? And will either side budge even if they do have a conversation? The Kenyan protests began because some of the taxes that Ruto's government proposed, like a 16% tax on bread, an annual 2.5% tax for owning a car, a levy on sanitary pads and diapers, and taxes on cancer treatment. These were the taxes that sparked the protests, and there was some course correction last week. Last Tuesday, they amended the bill, and most of the controversial taxes were scrapped. But the Kenyan government now wants to increase other levies instead. This is to avoid a revenue shortfall. They want to increase taxes on fuel and tariffs on imports. What will this mean? A fuel price hike has a wide impact. All forms of transportation become more costly, and that cost gets passed on to the end consumer, meaning that a fuel tax can lead to inflation. Then there are the import tariffs. This means that imported goods will become more expensive. Everything from food to diapers to cars, if they're imported, they will become more expensive. This is why the protests have continued in Kenya despite the government removing the controversial taxes. It's because the demonstrators believe it was a sleight of hand, that one way or another, things like food and diapers and sanitary pads are going to get more expensive. So instead of the amendment, the protesters want this year's finance bill scrapped. Will Ruto agree to this, or will there be a compromise? The clock is ticking.
Now let's look at the Pacific, at New Caledonia, which is a French overseas territory. Violence has returned to New Caledonia after a few weeks of calm. Fresh riots began on Sunday night. Protesters took to the streets of the capital of Noumea. A town hall in another city was set on fire. A police station was also targeted, and cars were burned out and used to block roads, preventing firefighters from carrying out their duty. It was chaos. To understand the cause of riots, we need to understand the history. New Caledonia is a French overseas territory. That means it was a French colony. In 1853, France had subjugated the local people known as the Canucks. Currently, the Canucks make up about 40% of the territory's population, and many want complete independence from France. New Caledonia has seen multiple independence referendums, and the latest one was disputed because it took place during the COVID-19 pandemic. So there is still a sizable group of Canucks who believe that they should have another referendum, another chance at demanding freedom. But in May, France proposed a change in voting regulations, which eventually led to riots. Presently, voting in New Caledonia is restricted. Only Canucks and people who already lived in the territory before 1998 can vote, including in referendums. This was to ensure that the Canucks were not marginalized by immigrants. That is why the vote freeze was implemented. New Caledonia's population has grown since 1998. About 40,000 French nationals have moved into the territory since then. Now that's enough immigrants to impact elections, to dilute the Kanak people's vote share. And in May, France proposed to do just that. They wanted to expand voting rights in New Caledonia, to extend voting rights to people who had lived in the territory for 10 years. The Canucks were against this. They knew it would dilute their vote share. So they protested. All of this happened in May. That was how the first riots were sparked. The riots forced French President Emmanuel Macron to visit New Caledonia to try and calm things down. Macron had talks with the leaders of Kanak pro-independence groups, and eventually he decided to pause the new voting rules. That pause is what led to tensions simmering down, bringing about the uneasy calm. But this calm was shattered over the weekend, leading to fresh riots. Last week, a number of Kanak pro-independence activists were arrested, including this man, Christian Tien. Now, he leads a group called the Field Action Coordination Cell, or the CCAT. French authorities blame him for instigating the violence in May. He was taken to court on Saturday and charged.
We have no information as to the exact date of the transfer. The only information we can give you at the moment is that he is in pre-trial detention and that it will take place in mainland France.
That was Tien's lawyer. He said that Tien will be held in pre-trial detention, 17,000 kilometers away from New Caledonia, in France.
Instead of imprisoning them in New Caledonia, they're being deported 17,000 kilometers away. This is outrageous. It's a way of criminalizing the Kanak people and their representatives.
Today, we clearly have colonial justice in Kanaki.
Now let's shift our focus to Europe. The European Union is clashing with China over trade. Earlier this month, Brussels pushed a proposal. It proposed a steep tariff on Chinese EVs. Europeans have been complaining about an oversupply from China, but not everyone agrees with the plan. Countries like Germany have criticized these tariffs. Brussels and Beijing now say they want to discuss the issue, try to resolve it through a dialogue. Does Europe plan to go easy on China? Our next report explores.
This may look like a car park to you, but this is a shipping port in Europe. All over the region, ports are flooded with Chinese cars like this. Their influx has hit Europe like an electric shock. So when Europe decided to slap tariffs on Chinese EVs, the move was seen as a bold step. To keep the oversupply from China in check, Brussels has planned to slap up to 38% in extra duties. But after the sharp response from Beijing, the EU's resolve is being put to the test. Over the weekend, top officials from both sides spoke. Brussels hasn't pulled the plug yet, but it has agreed to hold discussions with Beijing. In recent days, the differences within the bloc have become more obvious. Germany in particular has been against these tariffs. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been lobbying Brussels. He wants the EU to scale back its plan.
Ladies and gentlemen, free trade is one of the foundations of our prosperity in Germany and Europe. That is why I will be lobbying the new EU Commission vigorously in favor of more and better free trade agreements.
German leaders have visited China. This trip has been widely seen as a crisis visit to avert a full-blown trade war. There's pressure from the car-making industry too. China is a big market for German car makers, the likes of Volkswagen, BMW and Mercedes-Benz. These companies are worried about counter-tariffs from Beijing.
Having implemented those tariffs now, what is the goal of it? If you implement those to protect the industry, but the industry said we do not want this protection because we are dependent on the openness of our markets, but also of our guest markets, such as China.
Beijing is exploiting these divisions within Europe. For friendly countries like Germany, it's offering incentives. Berlin has been promised perks for its car makers like reduced tariffs. In exchange, China wants Germany's support to block the tariff plan. For rivals, Beijing is wielding the stick. China has launched an anti-dumping probe into French brandy. French cognac producers are worried too. They fear retaliation from Beijing due to the EV tariffs. Beijing is targeting European pork as well. Last week, it opened an investigation into the product. This is a tit-for-tat response to the EV tariffs. China is the world's biggest consumer of pork and it buys significant quantities from Europe, especially Spain and Denmark. So a complete ban would hurt these nations. China has put some extreme options on the table as well, like a lawsuit at the World Trade Organization.
China has principles that must be defended, namely WTO rules and market principles, and interests that must be maintained, namely the legitimate rights and interests of China's electric vehicle industry and enterprises. To this end, we will resolutely take all necessary measures.
Before its talks with Brussels, China has laid out its expectations. Chinese mouthpiece, the Global Times, has published a report. It says Beijing wants the EU to scrap the EV tariffs. China has set a deadline, the 4th of July. What if Brussels doesn't comply? A full-blown trade war could break out, and it remains to be seen if Brussels has the stomach for it.
Our next story tonight comes from the City of Angels, Los Angeles. It has passed a new resolution banning cell phones in schools. Now, this makes Los Angeles the largest school district in the U.S. to approve such a ban. The devices will be banned from next year. But how the policy will work is still not clear. Even so, the biggest question is, will the policy even work? Los Angeles is part of a growing trend in the US where many are weighing how to manage cell phone use in schools. Across the world, almost 1 in 4 countries have banned smartphones in schools. But smartphone crackdowns in classrooms are contentious. Should smartphones be banned in schools? Here's a report.
This is Los Angeles, the most populous city in the US state of California. It is home to not only the iconic Hollywood sign, but also a lot of schools. Los Angeles is the second largest school district in the US, and now it has passed a resolution that will most likely bring joy to the teachers' lounges everywhere. Los Angeles has banned cell phones from its classrooms, making it the largest school district in the US to approve such a ban. The city will ban devices from next year, but how the policy will work is still not clear. A couple of ideas are in the mix. Schools can lock up devices in lockers, or they can partner with companies that make special phone pouches, so cell phones can be kept in the pouches until they are released at the end of the day. Los Angeles plans to spend the next 120 days mapping out the implementation plan, and it needs the time, because it is easy to call for a phone ban, but much harder to execute it on the ground. Smartphone crackdowns are contentious. It is well documented how smartphones have a hold on adolescents. It is undisputed that smartphones can be a distraction in classrooms. Cell phones can fuel cyberbullying and insecurities. They can harm mental health. According to a frequently cited study, adolescents who spend more than 3 hours a day on social media face double the risk of mental health problems like anxiety and depression. And just this month, the US Surgeon General Vivek Murthy called for warning labels on social media platforms, kind of like the labels on alcohol and boxes of cigarettes. But there is a flip side here. Students use phones to contact parents during commutes. They use phones as payment methods or as tools in cases of emergency. Bans risk cutting students off from important resources. Also, no one is sure if the bans even work. According to one study, schools with cell phone bans reported higher rates of cyberbullying. But in another study, there was a reduction in cyberbullying.
The phenomena of adolescents getting access to smartphones and social media, this is something that's only existed since the early 2010s, right? And it takes time to conduct good research studies and for research studies to sort of build upon each other and for some sense of consensus to arise.
Most US schools already have some kind of phone policy. About 76% of schools prohibit their non-academic use. Last year, Florida became the first state to crack down on phones in school. Oklahoma, Vermont, and Kansas have also recently introduced the legislation. New York and California are also contemplating statewide policies on the issue. And the US is hardly alone. From Colombia to Bangladesh, from Italy to France, almost 1 in 4 countries has banned smartphones in schools globally. Recently in the UK, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak issued a guidance to stop the use of mobile phones in classrooms. But it was not a law, just a firm request. Ideally, there should be a balance between online safety and limiting smartphone access, but that's been hard to achieve. So while policymakers want to ban smartphones in schools, no one really knows how to do it.
Our last story today is about the Hajj. Over 1,300 people died this year during the annual pilgrimage due to a heat wave. Now, heat-related deaths at the Hajj are not new. They have been happening for centuries. But this year, the death toll was unusually high. It's because of exceptional circumstances. Rising temperatures, coupled with climate change, meant conditions that some humans could not endure. They collapsed on the streets. Many died of heat stroke. Saudi Arabia says it is not a failure of the system. But is that true? Our next report tells you.
For millions of Muslims across the globe, this is the journey of a lifetime. The Hajj is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It must be completed by all Muslims with the means at least once in their lives. But this year the annual pilgrimage took a deadly turn. Over 1,300 people died during the Hajj, all because of intense heat. Now, the Gulf has long dealt with high summer temperatures, but the climate crisis has pushed it above normal limits. This year, a heat wave supercharged by climate change meant temperatures soared over 50 degrees. Now, the Hajj season changes every year. So this year it was in June, which is one of the hottest months in the kingdom. And while there are air-conditioned facilities, the Hajj involves a lot of walking. Pilgrims walk an average of 4 hours every day. So with millions walking in the baking sun, many started to lose consciousness. Some even collapsed on the roads.
Yesterday we were on our way and we saw corpses on the road. They were covered white on the road. Because the temperatures here are really high. And I'm not just talking about old people, young people have died too.
Many people were on the ground, tired and losing consciousness. In Arafat it was the same. They were losing consciousness and were suffering from heat stroke and laying on the ground.
Some of these pilgrims were older. They had saved money all their lives to take the Hajj. They had underlying conditions. That, coupled with the risk of extreme heat, was deadly. Many died of a heat stroke. Pilgrims have since blamed poor infrastructure. They said it was badly organized. But Saudi Arabia says it wasn't the failure of the kingdom, instead it was an issue of illegal permits. The Hajj is one of the world's largest religious gatherings. Every year, Saudi Arabia issues nearly 1.8 million permits. Now, these permits are allocated to countries on a quota system. Individuals get it through a lottery. Official licenses can cost up to several $1,000s. But many either don't get these licenses or they can't afford them. So they enter the country unregistered. They risk arrest and deportation if caught. But unlicensed pilgrims also don't get access to the facilities like air-conditioned buses, free water and food supplies.
We thought we were about to die. We didn't even have the strength to reach the steels due to the extreme heat. My hands were shaking, my body was about to collapse, and I was unable to continue.
Countries are now cracking down on tourist agencies facilitating the Hajj for unlicensed pilgrims. But it's impossible to ignore the elephant in the room. That's climate change. Heat-related deaths in the Hajj are not new. They were recorded way back to the 1400s. But with rising temperatures and an older population, pilgrims are now more vulnerable, which means Riyadh will have to find ways to adapt to this climate crisis, or else it could put millions at risk in the coming years.
And now it's time for Vantage shots, images that tell the story. Brazilian women march in Sao Paulo against an abortion ban bill. Rome unearths ruins of an ancient laundry just a few steps away from the Vatican City. And an Indian temple uses a lifelike robotic elephant for rituals to prevent animal cruelty. Finally, taking you back in history. On this day in 1948, the Soviets blockaded West Berlin. Stalin cut off all land and river transit between West Berlin and West Germany. Panic set in as its population worried about shortages of food, water and aid. The Allies responded with a massive airlift to come to West Berlin's aid. Leaving you on that note, thank you for watching. See you tomorrow.
cross to the West Indies, what can we expect?